The Harvest Train. The town of East Haven was the kind of place people drove through without a second glance. Surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat, it was a farming community straight out of a pastoral postcard, except for the stories. The legends, whispered from generation to generation, all centered on a peculiar phenomenon, the harvest train. Every year on Halloween night, just as the clock struck midnight, an old freight train would roll through the outskirts of town. No tracks led to or from East Haven. The train simply appeared, cutting through the mist-shrouded fields, its whistle echoing like the wail of a ghost. No one ever saw it arrive or depart. There were no records of its existence. Yet the train was real enough that every soul in East Haven avoided the fields on Halloween night. The elders spoke of people who had disappeared over the decades, young men and women, vagrants, and even a few curious townsfolk who ignored the warnings. Those who vanished were never seen again, and the train's haunting appearance became the town's darkest mystery. Most dismissed the stories as superstitions, a way to keep children from wandering too far at night. But not everyone. The idea had been Clayton's, as most reckless ideas were. At 17, Clayton Monroe was the de facto leader of their little group. He had the charisma and the cocky grin that convinced people to follow him into trouble. There was Ellie, the skeptic, always rolling her eyes at Clayton's antics, but never quite able to say no. Marcus, quiet and cautious, who went along just to keep an eye on the others. And finally, Jamie, the youngest at 15, desperate to prove he wasn't just the tag-along kid. "I'm telling you, it's just an old ghost story," Clayton said, his voice low and conspiratorial as they sat around a crackling bonfire in the woods. "The train doesn't exist. It's just something the old folks made up to scare us." "My grandpa swears he saw it," Jamie said, his voice wavering. "Your grandpa also swears he saw Bigfoot," Ellie shot back, earning a snicker from Marcus. "I'm serious," Clayton said, leaning forward, his face lit by the flickering flames. "Let's prove it's all bullshit. We'll go out to the fields tonight and wait. Midnight. If there's no train, we can all laugh about it. If there is—" He trailed off, a grin spreading across his face. "We'll board it." "That's the dumbest idea you've ever had," Ellie said, but there was a flicker of intrigue in her eyes. "What are you, scared?" Clayton teased. "No, I'm not scared," Ellie shot back, bristling. "Then it's settled," Clayton said, slapping his hands together. "We'll meet at the old Miller barn at 11. Bring flashlights." Marcus glanced at Ellie, then at Jamie, who was already nodding eagerly. "This is a bad idea," Marcus muttered, but he knew he'd be there. He always was. The Miller barn was a crumbling relic at the edge of East Haven, long abandoned and leaning precariously against the encroaching fields. The group gathered there, shivering against the October chill, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The moon hung low and full, casting long shadows across the landscape. "This is so stupid," Ellie muttered, zipping up her jacket. "Relax," Clayton said, checking his watch. 5 minutes to midnight. If nothing happens, we'll go home, and you can tell everyone how brave you were." "Shh," Jamie said suddenly, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" They fell silent, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing but the rustle of corn stalks in the wind. Then it came, a distant, mournful whistle, low and haunting. The sound sent a shiver through all of them. "Holy shit," Clayton whispered, his bravado faltering for the first time. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the faint rumble of wheels on steel. A light pierced the darkness, cutting through the mist like a blade. The train emerged, its massive silhouette looming out of the fog. It was a freight train, its rusted cars groaning as it rolled to a stop in the middle of the field. The engine was ancient, its black paint peeling, its windows glowing with an eerie green light. "It's real," Jamie breathed, his eyes wide with both terror and wonder. "No way," Ellie said, her voice shaking. "This isn't possible. There's no tracks here." "Guess we're about to find out," Clayton said, his grin returning. He stepped forward, his flashlight beam dancing across the train cars. "Come on!" "Are you insane?" Marcus hissed. "We can't get on that thing." "What's the matter, Marcus?" Clayton taunted. "Scared of a little ghost story?" Without waiting for a response, Clayton grabbed the handle of a car and hoisted himself up. He turned, extending a hand to Jamie. "You coming or what?" Jamie hesitated, then took Clayton's hand. Ellie and Marcus exchanged a look. "This is a bad idea," Marcus said again. "Yeah, well, we can't let them go alone," Ellie muttered, following Jamie. With a resigned sigh, Marcus climbed up last. The interior of the train car was nothing like they expected. Instead of the grimy, empty space they'd imagined, it was filled with rows of wooden benches. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The benches were occupied. People sat in eerie stillness, there, faces pale and lifeless. Their clothes were old-fashioned, as though they'd stepped out of another century. Some wore overalls and straw hats, others dresses with high collars and lace. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring straight ahead. "What the hell?" Ellie whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. They look like the people who went missing," Jamie said, his voice barely audible. Marcus pointed to a man near the front of the car. "That's Mr. Grayson. He disappeared 20 years ago." "This isn't happening," Ellie said, backing toward the door. "This can't be real." "Hey!" Clayton called out, stepping closer to one of the passengers. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. Clayton reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact, the man's head snapped toward him, his eyes locking onto Clayton's with unnatural speed. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Clayton stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. The other passengers began to stir, their heads turning in unison to stare at the intruders. One by one they spoke, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of warnings. "The train must run. Fuel for the engine." "You shouldn't be here." The lanterns flickered, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger. "We need to go," Marcus said, grabbing Ellie's arm. "Now!" Before they could move, the door at the far end of the car slammed open. A figure stepped inside, cloaked in black, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The conductor. The conductor's presence was suffocating, as though the very air bent to his will. He moved slowly, deliberately, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. In his gloved hand, he held a lantern that burned with an unnatural blue flame. "Tickets," he intoned, his voice deep and resonant. "Tickets, please." Clayton stepped forward, his hands raised. "Look, we don't belong here. The conductor's head snapped toward him, silencing him instantly. "No ticket," the conductor said, his tone devoid of emotion. "No passage." The passengers began to rise from their seats, their movements jerky and unnatural. They advanced slowly, their vacant eyes fixed on the group. "Run!" Marcus shouted, shoving Ellie toward the door. They scrambled back the way they came, leaping from the train car just as the passengers closed in. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt and corn husks. Behind them, the train's whistle screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce their very souls. The train began to move, its wheels grinding against invisible tracks. The conductor stood at the open door, his lantern casting an eerie glow as he watched them. "The train must run," he called after them. "Fuel for the engine." The group didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the barn. Breathless and shaking, they collapsed onto the ground, their minds reeling from what they'd just experienced. "What was that?" Jamie gasped, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice trembling, "but we're never going near those fields again." "Agreed," Ellie said, her face pale. Clayton didn't say anything. He just stared out at the horizon, where the train had disappeared into the mist. In his hand, he clutched something he hadn't had before, an old, rusted ticket, the words, Admit 1, barely legible. The harvest train would return next year, and it would be waiting. My husband is changing. For the past couple of months, my marriage has been going down a slippery slope. Not to the point of divorce, but I feel that one more argument like the ones we've been having recently could bring it into the conversation. My husband and I have been married for about 10 years now, and things started just as I had always imagined, straight out of a fairy tale. But these past 2 years have seemed more like a fairy tale in which the prince and princess were just, well, simply not in love. There were no more roses, no more date nights, no more sex, and just no more affection. Sure, on occasion we would throw quips at each other, sparking the humor we used to love in each other, but it just wasn't the same. My husband was a chemical salesman and was always either at work or off on a business trip. Though we got in our fights and I could tell our love wasn't as strong, I still missed him. It was just us in that house, no pets, no kids, just a couple on the brink of what seemed to be the end of our fairy tale. Once again, my husband was packing to leave for the next morning, and we had surprisingly not gotten in any fights today, despite the fact he had been home for only 3 hours. "Where are you going this time?" I asked, leaning on the doorframe of our bedroom. "Oklahoma," he responded, looking for his clothes in the closet. "Gotta get this deal done so we can get this trip started." I always wanted to go to the Grand Canyon, and walking around the house, a visitor could spot refrigerator magnets, brochures, and a few paintings of the vast canyon in its glory. Something about it always drew me in. Maybe it was how it seemed to go on forever, or maybe it was just simply the multiple layers of colors it held going deeper into the canyon. Either way, he had surprised me about 2 days ago that he was planning on taking me there for our anniversary, maybe in an attempt to light the fire that had seemed to go out so long ago, and I was all for it. Even though these times had been rough, I was on board for a reset to try and rewrite this fairy tale, the right way this time. The rest of the night went on as usual, with me doing the dishes and sitting in front of the television watching my reality TV. Tonight was good, and he joined me on the couch, and it seemed like things were on the right track. Even in bed, we were the closest to each other we had been in what felt like decades. As I drifted into the darkness, I even caught him smiling at me just as I closed my eyes. Maybe things were back to normal. Waking up, I looked around to see nothing but an empty bed, with a note telling me goodbye with a heart around his name. Work had never been big for me, and in exchange for my husband working, I made sure to keep our house clean and looking just as it was when we first moved in. It was calm around the house, with the only noise being the humming of the fans from above. The chores around the house kept me busy throughout the day, with my lunch break being a PB&J and whatever chips I could find in the pantry. My husband had told me he was going to be gone for 2 days, which was usually how long he was gone, depending on the distance, but this time I felt like I couldn't wait that long. As good as yesterday was, I felt like I needed him around, like my old self felt when we first moved into this house. Today was Tuesday, which meant he would be back by Thursday, and not only was I ready to see him, but I was ready to begin the new chapter in our relationship. Minutes passed that felt like hours, those hours like days, and before I knew it, they turned into those days. It was Friday, and I'd gotten no text back, no call, or any sign that he was even alive. Waking up Saturday, I hoped to see the image of my husband lying beside me, with the explanation ready for where the hell he had been. But of course, there was nothing but his pillow and the covers. Just when all hope was lost, a knock echoed through the entire house, which jolted me out of my bed, dashing into the living room. With a smile that could have been used as a lighthouse, I swung the door open to see my husband now looking back at me. Before a word could be said, I swung my arms around him and welcomed him back while trying to practically squeeze the life out of him. I felt his arms slowly wrap around me, not matching the force I had given, but lightly, almost as those young couples. You see, hugging as if they were committing a cardinal sin. Backing away, I looked up to see a lifeless and tired expression placed on his face with messed up hair that looked like he had just got done skydiving. Pulling him inside, he seemed like he had just run a marathon, and though I was worried, the joy was overwhelming. He always came home tired, and I didn't blame him. So as always, after greeting him, I started my chores and let him rest. As the day went on, I made sure to look around to hopefully catch sight of him, but there was never anything. I crept to our door to peek in, and just as I thought he was on his side, facing away in the dark room, watching for a moment, I noticed that he was breathing, but very, very slowly. In my head, I counted how long his shoulder raised and lowered, and it was a solid minute in between. Maybe he was just sleeping weirdly. I watched some more and caught a glimpse of the reflection of the clock on my side of the bed of his face. His eyes were wide open, and he never blinked, and yet again he kept that same lifeless face from when he was at the door. Maybe he was sleeping with his eyes open, or maybe he was playing a trick on me. Whatever the reason, I decided it was best to go back to my chores. It was about 2 hours later when the shadows of the house began to expand, and the light from the sun began to creep behind the horizon, giving everything an orange glow. A soothing color. Finishing up my vacuuming, I was on the last bit of the rug when I felt the hard tension of the cord from behind me. I turned around to see my husband standing there with the clothes I set on him, just staring at me. "Good morning, sunshine," I said while giving him a quick peck on the lips. "Long trip?" "Yes," he replied in a monotone voice. "Very long." "I thought you said 2 days, Joseph. You had me worried sick. I thought you were never coming back." "Long trip." After the brief conversation, he turned around and made his way to the couch, and with a loud plop, he sat there in an upright position. Finally getting the rug done, I began to ring up the cord and carry the vacuum back into the closet, but I couldn't help but feel the intense stare coming from the couch. I still had yet to understand why he was acting this way, but maybe he was just tired, or maybe he was checking me out. Either way, I decided to ignore it and move on. About 30 minutes passed, and there was still silence, except for the clutter I was making from preparing his favorite dish to welcome him back. Sometimes I swear I could hear a shuffle on the rug, and would look back to see nothing but the black screen of the TV and the reflection of my husband just looking. It seemed as if he was watching the reflection of me through the TV, and the sight of his hands placed gently on his knees began to freak me out a little. I needed to understand why he was acting this way. Handing him his food, I turned on the TV to break the silence and tried to ask him what he had done on his trip, and if he had done the big deal. But I couldn't get anything out other than a stare and a few short sentences. I decided to turn on my show and saw in my peripheral as he picked up his food and chopped it down with a few bites. It only took about 4 bites for him to finish the whole thing, and as I picked up the dish, I noticed something red on the table. There was nothing red in the food I had prepared, and with confusion looked around his hand to see a chunk of his finger bitten off by his eating. The blood was pouring down his finger onto his hand, and little drops of blood began rippling in the pool it was creating. "Oh God, Joseph," I screeched, running to the bathroom to get a Band-Aid. The chunk was pretty big, and though a Band-Aid wasn't going to entirely solve the problem, I felt that it would do the job from now to the hospital. "We need to take you to see someone right now." "No!" he yelled, pulling his hand away. "Just a long trip." What the hell had gotten into him? The last time I saw him, he seemed like he was back to the Prince Charming I had once fallen in love with, but now it seemed as if he was converting back to the Beast. The rest of the night was silent, with only the TV making sound and me trying my best to stay away from him. I decided to take a shower, and for some reason felt an unease as if I wasn't alone. Once again, I felt like I could hear him moving around, but each time I pulled the curtains there was nothing. I was no nurse, but what he had done to his finger was bad, and I was certain he would bleed out. But he was set that he wasn't seeing anyone but me. Finishing my shower, I was getting ready to pull the curtains when I caught a glimpse of something in the water. It looked as if a single drop of blood had gone into the other side of the shower and now was slowly coming to the drain. Was he in here with me? I swung open the curtains to what I thought was his hand, quickly jolting from around the doorframe into the nothingness. Not daring to say a word, I went to the bed and decided it would be best to let him come in instead of calling for him, and by no surprise I felt his side of the bed slump down and his head hit the pillow. Before closing my eyes, I looked into the reflection of my alarm to see him staring at me. His eyes pierced through the darkness and his teeth seemed to have a red tint from the blood. Shutting my eyes as hard as I could, I focused purely on sleeping, to get this nightmare over with. The next couple of days were all the same. He seemed to move like a statue and would only take his steps if I was looking. He never went to work and I was too scared to ask why. Doing my chores felt as if I was being stalked, to where if I made a sharp turn, I could catch a glimpse of part of his body in a doorframe across the room. It wasn't until a week when I began to catch the odor of something rotten, something that smelled as if it had seeped through the cracks of hell into the house. It never went away, and in our bedroom was where I could tell the smell was the strongest. My husband hadn't taken a shower ever since he got back, and each time I wanted to confront him, I remembered that yell on the couch, so much authority that I felt like a prisoner in my own house. Other changes to him became more and more obvious. As the hours passed by, his skin began to feel soft to the touch, but too soft, almost like the feeling of a warm, soggy tortilla. His thick brown hair began to thin, and I would always find clumps of hair in places where he must have been standing, always close to me. I never could explain what was going on and was too scared to find out. I didn't dare walk outside, or I felt like yelling would be the least of my worries. The thing I noticed most, however, from him was that he always stared at me. I never saw his eyes budge and never saw a blink, but his whole head would turn with his gaze. I tried my best to keep my distance. The house was often silent, especially these past days, when suddenly I heard the phone ringing from within the kitchen. Almost like a child heard the ice cream truck, I ran to the noise and picked up the phone hoping it was anyone other than my husband, anyone who could maybe help me. In the distance of my house, I could hear the silent creak of a door, opening but no sounds of movement either way. I didn't care. Hello, hello, can you hear me? It felt as if I had been stranded on an island and finally caught a glimpse of a plane. For a moment, I felt the pressure of my husband, of the stench, of the little pieces of him all around the house go away. I felt free. Is this Mrs. Carter? A voice responded with the background of phones and people shuffling around the operator. Yes. Oh, thank God, it's so new. I was cut off by the person. Ma'am, are you okay? Yes, I am now. I've been trapped in this house with my husband for so long, it's just so nice to hear another voice. Your husband? Yes, I'm not sure what has been wrong with him, but he's been acting strange. But now with you, I'm safe. Thank you so much. Trying to hold back my tears, ready to run out the door. Ma'am, the reason I called was to inform you about your husband. I'm so sorry, but your husband was found 3 days ago on a ranch in Oklahoma. He seemed to have been attacked by some animal. Whoever is in that house with you is not your husband. Do you want me to send somebody to your location? Fear. Straight and pure fear. I could feel the blood become cold in my body. My mind was blank, yet screamed so many things. I let go of the phone as it dangled from the cord and stared at the window to the yard. For the past week, I had slept with my husband, kissed my husband, and cared for him. And yet if that wasn't him, what had been there? What had taken his spot? I wasn't going to dare leave the kitchen when I could hear a silent splat coming from the living room. It wasn't loud, but every couple of seconds, the sound of a drop of some liquid hitting a puddle of some sort. Some seconds post, the drops got more and more frequent, and that's when I heard a god-awful noise. It was quiet, but I could hear a sort of sobbing emanating from the room. This sob didn't sound normal, but as if multiple voices were conjoined to make this hellish sound. I could make out the sound of my husband among the others, but all were lightly conjoined into one harmonious, twisted sound. I reached for a knife and stayed close to the wall while creeping to an angle where I could see the reflection in the window. The laughing got a little louder with each inch I moved, and the drops continued to echo. When I was at the perfect angle, I focused on the window to see the image of my husband, standing there, smiling and staring. I could make out a liquid dripping from his mouth as he stood there just tracking me, almost like he could see me through the wall. Building up the courage to turn the corner, I twisted my body towards him with the knife pointing at him. The eyes. Oh, God, the eyes! They stared at me into my soul, and I noticed one was lower than the other. His skin looked mushy, and his hair was practically gone at this point, having been forced out with multiple pulls. I could tell by the scalps forming from where his hair had been. I looked at his mouth to see the most hideous smile. I could hear the subtle crack of his teeth as he grinned so hard his gums began to tear. Pushing his teeth onto one another made his gums bleed, and every so often one tooth would disappear into the back of his mouth. "What the hell are you?" I yelled at him. Looking happy to answer my question, everything stopped, and he just stood there looking at me. The blood stopped along with the laughing, and it was suddenly just me and my hell-bent husband. His mouth began to slowly open, and just when I thought it was done, he grabbed the upper and lower part of his mouth and began to pull. His eyes began to tear, and his flesh began to rip as he pulled more and more. I fell in horror, trying to back up, as what I thought was my husband was becoming more like something out of a nightmare. Fingers began to slide out from his mouth until I could make out two crooked hands overlapping his own. Then the ripping, starting at his head like a zipper, the team of hands pulled him apart as something yearned to come out of the body that once laid with me. I could piece one by one a head, a torso, and finally a full figure stepping in front of me. Satan himself, pure evil, looking at me with hatred. This force overwhelmed me, a strong and terrible force. Voices uttered in my mind terrible, horrifying things, wanting me to bow to their will. I couldn't. I was better than the demons. Haunting me? Or was I? My whole life had been meaningless. Everything was gone, my husband, my parents. What was there to live for? Humans are no better than the demons that walk below us, so why should I try and infect this world any longer? These thoughts rushed in, and before I knew I was drowning in an ocean of anguish, disgust and pain. Maybe it was the figure in front, of me making me feel all these terrible things. Of course it was, but maybe I had been suppressing these emotions for far too long. It wasn't making me think these things, but rather helping me let my true intentions come clean. Where I thought this thing was driving me into a place of madness, it was helping me see the light and what needed to be done. I missed my husband and parents, and everyone that I loved was gone, and I knew how to get to them. I raised the knife with a smile and tears in my eyes, looked at the beast in front of me in the eyes, which gave a crooked smile back, and pushed the knife hard into my skull.